Welcome to the I Told You So podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Ben Cole. I started this podcast because I noticed an erosion of societal discourse and how normal conversations are often fueled by polarization. The I Told You So podcast offers an opportunity for healthy discourse and effective discussions. I select topics to discuss with listeners and guests of the I Told You So podcast. Listeners and guests predict what will happen in the future. I track those predictions and announce who predicted accurately when those predictions become true. The podcast offers topics where listeners and guests can participate in discussions with the goal of predicting the future so they can proudly say, I told you so. My guest for this episode is Dr. Sue Peterson. Dr. Peterson earned a Bachelor of Science degree from Kansas State University, a master's in public administration from the University of Kansas, and a Doctor of Philosophy from Kansas State University. Dr. Sue Peterson most recently served as the Chief Government Relations Officer, the Assistant to the President Emeritus at Kansas State University from 1989 until May 2023. Dr. Peterson went to work at her alma mater, Kansas State University, from the office of the Kansas Governor Mike Hayden, where she was a director of legislative relations from 1987 to 1989. Prior to joining the governor's office, Dr. Peterson served as chief of staff to the House Majority Leader from 1978 to 1982 and chief of staff to the Speaker of the House, both in the Kansas legislature. In her role at Kansas State University, Dr. Peterson had direct responsibility for all Kansas State University liaison activities with the Kansas legislature, the Kansas executive branch agencies, and the Kansas congressional delegation. Following her departure from Kansas State University, Dr. Peterson founded the government relations firm Amethyst Axiom, and that's Amethyst, and then Axiom, Axiom. The firm's concentration is state legislative strategy and advocacy. Dr. Peterson was a founding member of the Kansas Board of Regents Council on Government Relations. She was also one of two founding members of the Big 12 Council of Governmental Relations Officers. Dr. Peterson was also a member of the Association of Public and Land Grant Universities Council on Governmental Affairs. She served 2 terms on the council's executive committee and 2 terms as secretary. Dr. Peterson also served in the role of Agriculture Appropriations Team Lead as the Council on Governmental Affairs liaison to the Agriculture Budget and Advocacy Committee. At the 2019 Council on Governmental Affairs Summer Conference, Dr. Peterson delivered the Betty Colden Memorial Lectureship Address and received the Career Excellence Award from the Council on Governmental Affairs. Dr. Peterson was a member of the American Association of State Colleges and Universities Higher Education Government Relations Conference Task Force from 2016 to 2020 and was task force chair in 2019. In 2012, she was awarded the Marvin D. Swade Johnson Achievement Award, that's SWEDE, which is awarded by the leading higher education national associations. Dr. Peterson currently serves as an instructor in the Kansas State University Political Science Department. Dr. Peterson is married to Charlie, who is a retired K-State Sports Senior Associate Athletic Director, and they reside in Manhattan, Kansas. So on this episode today, Dr. Sue Peterson and I discuss state government, Kansas specifically, governmental affairs, higher education, and why elections matter to state higher educational institutions. So, Dr. Peterson, what a life you've had so far. Congratulations on all your awards and all the career endeavors you have participated in. And so great to have you on the podcast today. Let me start the podcast by asking you, or actually, I'd like you to tell me about your experience from when you began working in state governance and kind of explain how that's changed up till today.
Well, thank you, Ben. Listening to that and listening to those dates, I'm feeling kind of old. Been
You don't
around for
look
a bit.
old.
Oh, you're
You
nice
look
to say that. Kind of
like
been
you're
around for a bit.
29.
Um, you know, so I was thinking about this when we discussed this podcast today, and when I started in the Kansas State Legislature, working in the Majority Leader's office back in 1978, there were very few women. There were very few women. There were no women staff members in the legislature. There were administrative staff were female, most of the time. There were very few female legislators. I worked in the House, but just a little tidbit: the Kansas Senate did not have a female bathroom. So the one sitting Kansas senator had to go out in the hall to use the restroom while the men enjoyed a bathroom right outside the chamber, didn't have to walk through the lobbyist gauntlet out in the hall. I always
Unbelievable.
kind of felt kind of sorry for her. And there weren't women lobbyists.
Yeah,
There weren't very many women lobbyists. When I started at Kansas State in my role, all the um, all the other state universities were represented by men. So I think some of the biggest change in my career started from 78 forward, and working in the Kansas legislature in different roles, as you mentioned, in that time period, is the fact that we've kind of migrated away from older individuals to younger people, a lot more women in the legislature, a lot more women lobbyists, and a lot more women in senior staff roles. And, interestingly enough, um, Kansas, who I think sometimes doesn't get very progressive, has had three female governors. The other interesting thing is they've all been Democrats.
yes.
They've all been Democrats. So
What
I
tradition
think,
is the red state?
yeah, interesting tradition for a red state. Absolutely. Very interesting. So I would just say a lot has changed, but the demographics, I think, are kind of overall the biggest change of who's involved.
Yeah, so help me understand more about your experience with advocating on the behalf of students and faculty and staff and alumni at Kansas State University.
Well, if you can, I have one story.
You can have a story.
Okay. Um, K-State used to be funded, and all the state universities were funded by a formula called the enrollment adjustment formula.
Yeah.
And that's if you went up in students, you received more money from the state. And if you went down, you theoretically would lose some money from the state. And you never wanted to be in the downslide. So back in the late 80s, K-State, it was a formula, and you did a mathematical calculation to get to the formula. So K-State submitted their formula information, but their calculation was incorrect.
Hmm.
And there was a decimal point in the wrong place. So instead of a million, it was 100,000. Should have been a million. And so then President Weefald and his team contacted me. I was working for Governor Hayden at that time. And the budget director, Michael O'Keefe, and myself, we came over, we met with them. We understood the problem, but you can't just say, okay, we're fixing it. You have to get an appropriation through the Kansas legislature. And at that time, Kansas State had two great women, interestingly enough, two women representing Manhattan and Kansas State, but they were Democrats. And the majority of the party was Republican, and they just didn't want to hand over $1 million. I mean, today that doesn't sound like a lot of money, but it still is quite a bit of money. Back then, it was a very big amount of money.
Right.
So I helped them. We met on a Sunday, in fact. The legislature met on a Sunday, and that appropriation finally went through. So I got to know then President Weefald and his team. And when the position of government affairs assistant to the president came open, I applied for the position. I was hired. And then I just had a wonderful time working for my alma mater, working with students, working with I didn't know anything about higher ed. It's the interesting thing about these jobs is if you know the legislature, then you can learn the higher ed. It's almost harder to know higher ed and then learn the legislature.
Right.
So I think it worked for me, and I was known in the legislature, and I worked in both the executive and the legislative branches. And so I had a lot of background from that standpoint and knew most everybody in the Capitol. So it really was a good fit for me, and I really enjoyed every year. I didn't enjoy every day, but almost, almost.
So, yeah, so tell me, what are your thoughts about Kansas public policy specifically thinking about the future. So I'm thinking about state spending, higher education, other government functions. So help me understand more about your thoughts about where we're going as a state as far as public policy is concerned, especially in those areas I just mentioned.
So, what I have really been kind of chagrined about over time, Ben, is the fact that I think sometimes the executive branch, the leadership, the governor, and the legislature have a bigger agenda than thinking about taking care of the state of Kansas and state government. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is Kansas State receives probably today, I don't know the new numbers, probably somewhere between 18 and 20% of their total funding comes from the state. And then another piece from students. And so consequently, you think, well, why do we have to listen to the state? Well, first of all, 20% is nothing to sneeze about in a $900 million budget. And they're the landlord. They own the campus. They own every building at Kansas State. So you really do need to be involved with them. So having said that, I think they need to understand is, hey, if you don't represent Manhattan, that doesn't mean you don't care about Kansas State and want to have an investment in Kansas State and make sure it's a great place. Same thing for Pittsburgh State. Same thing for the University of Kansas. So I think we've gotten to a point where we are agenda focused a lot and we are geography focused. So if you're from Western Kansas, there's not a lot of legislators anymore, and it's hard for them necessarily to kind of break through and talk about rural policies. But I think sometimes we just forget that the state government and the institutions belong to the people of the state, and the legislature is their custodian.
Yeah. So I guess help me understand more about um, your role in, I guess, advocating for the needs of Kansas State University. I know you're really influential in that, and there's only so much money that can go around from the Kansas Board of Regents and from state taxpayers. So maybe help the listeners understand maybe a win story that you've had in your experience where you really went to bat for Kansas State University and got everybody on your side.
Um, Hale Library, one of my favorite places on campus, and I think a great success story. So back in the 80s, the late 80s, the students want a bigger library. They wanted more study space. And the administration of the university sets priorities for facilities, capital improvement priorities, and they did not have the library on the list. So the students, bright students that they were, they staged a sit-in in the library and to try to get the administration's attention at Kansas State that they wanted a new library. They wanted more space. And it took a while, but it got the administration's attention finally. So finally the administration said, okay, we're going to put an expansion to Hale Library, then Farrell Library. I don't know how long, Ben, you've been in town, but it was Farrell Library at that time, named for former President Farrell. And so they finally put the funding on the list. Well, it's a big lift. It was a lot of money, and we wanted to add 153,000 gross square feet, 153,000 gross square feet. So the legislature, they balked. But at the same time, something happened down the river at the University of Kansas. They had a fire in Hoke Auditorium, and they wanted to replace it because it had their large classrooms in Hoke Auditorium. And it was also then going to be connected to one of their science libraries. So the legislature, and this legislator is still, was in the legislature, left, and is back. And he's a great legislator from Wichita. His name's Henry Halverson. He knows his stuff really well. He discovered that the state had overpaid the federal government $140 million. And so we were going to get a one-time return from the federal government of $140 million. Well, it's one time. And in the state legislature, they don't spend a lot of money if it's going to be reoccurring, unless it's a program that they're interested in, like a highway plan. So they had $140 million. They gave money to Hoke, they gave money to the K-State Library, and they gave money to Wichita State and another, I think, Pittsburgh State. But in my mind, that was really one of the most important things. And here's we didn't have cell phones, but we had a bank of payphones outside the Senate. And after the Senate had voted that night, and the president of the Senate had to break a tie in order for the money to be added in for K-State. I called President Weefald, and he said, "Oh, I already know, Sue. I heard it on the 10 o'clock news." And I said, "Yes, sir, Dr. Weefald," but the bill hadn't passed yet. And the bill had passed, and I went to a payphone and I called him at like 11:30 at night and said, "You're going to get a library." And so that was, it's a great story, and it's a beautiful library today. Excuse me. So we have, multiple different additions to the library, but now it looks. There's a 27 building and a 65 stacks and a 72 building, and then we built that building in the mid 90s. Now, unfortunately, the fire, caused a setback, but the building has been rebuilt and reopened, and it's still beautiful. It's more beautiful than it was before.
That's right. Yeah. So really appreciate your comments on this. So I guess let me ask you this. If you were to make a prediction on the future of higher education, and I'm thinking more in your realm, I'm thinking as
Mhm.
seen over the past years, the amount of allocation coming from the taxpayers, coming from the state, allocated through the Kansas Board of Regents, as that's reduced, that's gone down, that's decreased over the years. It seems to me that even public education has become more and more really private in some way. So do you see that continuing? Do you see maybe an influx of funding from the taxpayer? Do you see that allocation percent going up or down in the future? And depending on what you say, what do you think the next step is for higher education as we look toward the future?
Well, it ebbs and flows on the state's resources.
Yeah.
So if the state has money, it's a lot simpler to ask for nice investments for higher education, and they do that. In the past, even though they haven't had some money, they've made some nice investments in student financial aid. I think that's really critical for students to have access to K-State and all the other higher education institutions in the state, including the community colleges, the tech colleges, and the private universities. They have a grant program for the private universities. So I think that's been helpful. I know universities like to build buildings. They like to start new programs. They like to hire, very relevant, important researchers, and that all takes cash. You know that in your role at the university and the lab you worked in. So those are important things. And sometimes those are sort of not real tangible. Student financial aid is tangible. Buildings are tangible, though they don't like to, they think we just keep building buildings at universities and never do anything else. But sometimes things, are frankly wear out. And you've got to do that. And you've got to either make an investment or you've got to tear down and start over or recalibrate your space. So I think the bad news is they budget every year. Former President Myers, came out of the federal government and out of the Pentagon, and the Pentagon had a multiple year budget, federal budget. And he really struggled in the beginning to say, what do I do? Why do I not know how much money I'm going to have year after next, Sue? And I said, because the state doesn't know how much money they're going to have year after next, General. And so consequently, we're just 1 year at a time. We're at their mercy. So I think that it's not as negative as I've seen it in the past, but I'd say two things, Ben. You got to take care of students and Kansas students first, and then out of state students, so you can diversify your population. And the second thing is you have to remain relevant. And
Mhm.
I like K-State's tagline, the University for Kansans. I think that's terrific. And legislators will do something and they think there's something in it for them and their constituents. I think that's important.
Good. Yeah, really appreciate that. Very good perspective. And it means a lot coming from you with all the experience you've had. And so I thank you very much again for being a guest on the I Told You So podcast, Dr. Peterson. So if listeners want to get in touch with Dr. Sue Peterson, simply send an email message to her, and it is her email address is skp@ksu.edu, or you can call her or text message her at 785-341-6717. Because this podcast is about predicting the future, my questions to those listening are, do you think higher education is a public or private good? Should the state help students, or should the student shoulder most of the educational costs? Do you know your state representative and state senator? Do you know who they are? And are you registered to vote? And do you plan to vote? So, and then one more thing. What do you think? Do you agree with Dr. Peterson's assessment of where we think higher education is going, especially in the realm of governmental relations? So I'd love to know. Text me or call me. You can do that at 785-473-3721 or send an email message to me at ITYS at BenKohlITYS.com or post on any of my social media channels. So I do ask you to go to the I Told You So podcast website at BenKohlITYS.com. That's my name, BenKohlITYS.com. And you can go there to connect or get your own I Told You So items at the merchandise link. You can get shirts and hats and hoodies and coffee mugs. And I've got one right here if you want one of those. So lots of items to choose from, but I do ask you to follow the podcast on Spotify or subscribe on YouTube. And remember, the goal of this podcast is to provide a space for healthy discourse and effective discussions. And with that, the goal is predicting the future so you can proudly say, I told you so. So if your business or organization is interested in advertising on the I Told You So podcast, please let me know that too. So thanks for tuning into the I Told You So podcast. And thanks again to my guest, Dr. Sue Peterson. Followers of the podcast are very important. So remember to please follow, like, subscribe, leave a comment, give a high rating, and share with your friends. I'm your host, Dr. Ben Kohl, and I hope to hear from you soon.